Today we're going to talk a little bit about how we are all. I'm gonna go out on a limb here and assume everyone in this room is a technologist. We're all technologists. We're pretty sure we can solve most problems with the application of some C groups and namespaces. That solves all problems in life, right? Yeah. So problem is, we get really excited about technologies that we are pretty sure are going to solve a lot of the problems we have. Spoiler alert, does not always go that way. We're going to talk about it. Okay, so got to have the obligatory second slide, which also serves as my test pattern. It's very nice to see if things are getting, overscanned, truncated, et cetera. As Warner mentioned, I work for Microsoft. I've worked there on the cloud developer advocacy team for about a year. And fun fact, I still don't have a Windows box because I was like, when I interviewed, I said, okay, yes, the stuff you're doing with Azure seems pretty cool. Windows is a deal breaker. And they said, oh no, it's fine, we'll give you a Mac. I'm like, all right, cool. So that's more on that later. I live in Minneapolis, and I podcast with Arrested DevOps, and I am, in fact, the chief cook and bottle washer of the, mysterious cabal that helps bring you DevOps days. The one in Columbus was last month, but they are probably planning to do another one next year. I'm assuming, is that right, Warner? Yes. And if you have traveled here from a different city and it was an inconvenient amount of time and you would love to run a DevOps Days in your own city, I think we're in about 70 cities on 6 continents in 2018. So you could perhaps run a 2019 one, especially if you happen to work at McMurdo Station, because it would be really nice to get that 7th continent. So, all right, so I usually, literally for Microsoft, my job is to go around giving people free open source Kubernetes workshops. So that's what I'm usually talking about. I'm not really going to be talking about Kubernetes today. I will say that if that sounds exciting to you and you too would like the, former evil empire to pay you to be a member of the Rebel Alliance, cool, we're hiring. Please, so that is something to consider right there. But enough on that. First, I'm going to tell you a lie, because I feel like a lot of times people tell you that computers are the easy part and, dealing with people is hard, and you're like, right? And so I've used this slide a number of times. You've probably, if you've gone to my website, I have a Google unique name. In the 70s, my parents very conveniently gave me a Google unique name. So you can see that, spoilers, yeah. As it turns out, we're creating systems that are significantly more complex than anything we've created before. They start to have the fractal complexity found in nature, which means that, yeah, it is actually hard for us to create and operate and maintain and change these systems. And the human factors, those people that you kind of shake your tiny fist at in your head, are actually part of these complex systems. And so we kind of do have to think about that human factor, because otherwise it's really hard to construct and operate these complex systems at scale. And I feel like every conference talk, especially with somebody who appears to be from Microsoft and whatever, needs a little bit of bona fides. I got a CS degree in the 90s. Looking back, I think it's clear that it was mostly because I didn't want to talk to people. Spoiler alert, tech is actually all about talking to people. But I look back, and I still have these textbooks, and that board is from the Convex C1 that our ACM student office had. When we disassembled it, I took it home. I also have the front panel. You can see it sometimes in the background of one of my podcasts. But I pulled these books out when I wanted to kind of I wanted to illustrate a point, which is, it's easy for us to say, if we've been doing this a while, I'm looking around the room, some of you are around my age, some of you might have been on call for Y2K. I was on call for Y2K. The worst thing that happened was my pager was really heavy and broke the strap on my party dress. But that's not because it was bullshit. It's because we all worked really hard to make it not a problem. And I think that it's important for us to look back and realize that, A, we have been doing this stuff a while. We are getting pretty good at it. But B, a lot of people are coming along who maybe they're like, I think I talked to somebody at the party last night who was like, yeah, Y2K, I was 10. And I'm like, oh dear. But if you think about it, every single person coming along in tech has their own valid, excellent, different perspective than yours. And I think it's really easier for us when we start talking about demographic ticky boxes to assume that that's just so that like people feel good and included and loved and hugged or whatever. But like actually, it's really valuable that we have people who are maybe helping us operate systems and have come out of the Node.js world or whatever. And I'm like, I don't have any genes skinny enough to operate Node.js. I think that's what a boss of mine once said, and I was like, yeah, pretty much. But it is also really valuable, right, to consider that people who might have to think a lot about what NPM and leftpad are doing to their lives, it's good to have their perspective, right? Even if we are not coming from the exact same place. We're all working on this stuff together. And I think that we also have a lot of cliches and patterns and maybe anti-patterns in tech. This is not photoshopped. I took this picture in Minneapolis. They have, I think, since moved some of those shipping containers. But there's a great deal of, cloud and containers and some greenfield there. Possibly right? And probably the slow-burning tire fire is probably your Kubernetes cluster. You've got, because I got to tell you, people have a lot of problems running this stuff in production, right? And this is, by the way, quick Kubernetes sidebar. If you actually want to run it in production, you probably should at least start by looking at your cloud provider of choice and seeing what they have that takes away some of the complexity for you. It won't take away all of it. But, okay, but anyway, I feel like we can get hung up on the tech. And I think it's really important for us to look at some of the things in our social structures that also influence how things go. Like, first things first, I love tech. I'm a nerd. I still edit everything in VI. My coworkers tell me VS Code is really great, and I'm like, but VI. But tech itself is not going to solve absolutely everything that we're trying to do, unfortunately. We can probably look at noted technology thought leader Jane Austen when she did say, in fact, she wrote that anyone with any containers is in want of a container platform, or something along those lines. And I would say that even if this is from a diagram from it was like a magazine in the 1890s, and they were working on predicting the 1990s. They were working on predicting 100 years in the future. And what I think is really interesting about it is, sartorial challenges aside, they're not wrong. Like, hey, look, they were predicting our video calls where the sound doesn't work. Like, this is definitely the sort of thing that was expected, right? And I feel like every time we're trying to create technology solutions, we're trying to imagine a future where we're kind of imagining it like that. Like, you know what? The rough outline is probably right, and some of the other stuff is going to be really, really wrong, and that is okay. Like, we're not magic. We're not actually expected to produce, or rather, we produce the future. We aren't expected to predict it perfectly, because it's going to be an iterative process. But I think we have to really watch out for assuming that technology will solve all of these problems, right? And there's this wall of confusion, the classic wall of confusion that Andrew Clay Schaefer, who I worked for a couple of years and still talk to all the time, put this wall of confusion idea out there. This divide between, like, say, your development team and your operations team. I don't think it's exactly right. I usually remix it to be something like this, because it's all about how the incentives are set up inside your organization, right? So you can have great technology, and you can have a release to celebrate your new feature that went really well, and you can have some people in the operations team who probably have a fire that's not even slow burning on their hands, because it turns out if one team is incentivized by getting that release out quickly, and another team is incentivized by keeping everything really stable, those incentives are the problem. Like, you don't have to have bad cross-team collaboration, but if you're incentivizing people at cross purposes, this is that human thing that the technology itself isn't going to change inside our organization. There's another, and yeah, I got to tell you, there's also like dev and ops, and people are like, those teams don't get along. Let's get an ill-conceived DevOps silo. And like, they'll use some C groups and namespaces, and that'll make the devs and the ops get along. It's like, that, we all know that doesn't actually work, probably because we've tried it. There's also, and I think it's fair to point out, do we have any security people in the house? Yeah, we definitely do. So you may have seen this picture that Pete Cheslock used at DevOps Days in Austin in 2015. And what I appreciate about this is like, we, again, as humans, we like to make things simple and Boolean, and like tech is, maybe our numbers that way, but like we're not, we're not able to say like, we'll have DevOps and magic and rainbows, and security is like, like we have to all work together across teams. So I think that's the TLDR there. Like, you're not going to have, DevOps magic where you get certified for it and then you're done. Like, that's not actually real. And I'm all for everyone trying to have good cross-team collaboration and good technology, but like, I think it's really easy for somebody to say, oh, we did our DevOps initiative in Q3 last year, so we're very DevOps now. And it's like, I think that the unicorn and rainbow and security people have something to say about that. So I think it's valuable just to think about, for example, one place where a lot of that tension comes in between teams is when you've shipped something and you have the fun question of, does it work? Is it working? Is all of the end user data getting horribly and irrevocably corrupted right now by this canary of the new release? Like, if you don't have tooling built to answer that question, you're gonna be a lot twitchier about deploying anything, right? And so while tools are not going to solve this problem, we can use tools to reduce a lot of that stress between in our organizations if we can actually answer questions about what's happening inside our systems. And if you're thinking like, but that's so obvious, Bridget, like, oh, how sweet, you've never been on call. Okay, cool. But I invite you to be on call for production and then figure out whether or not you can answer those questions about your system. And it's like conflict from misaligned incentives. Andrew Clichés actually says that any running system is in a state of continuous partial failure at all times. And like, that's true. And I think that you can have continuous partial failure and not have like a complete disaster. Does anyone know what this ship is? I always like to poll and see if anyone is actually familiar with this. Cool. All right, I'll tell you a quick story. It was the 17th century, and Sweden decided to go to war with Denmark, as one does. And the wily king of Denmark had like giant new fancy ships. And so Sweden decided that they too needed to deploy giant new fancy warships. And this would have gone well, maybe, except that there was scope creep and a lack of documentation, and the shipwright died during construction. And they didn't have all the right parts, and the king was like, YOLO, ship anyway. And so what they ended up shipping a ship with 2 gun decks, which was scope creep and innovation that had never actually been deployed by the Swedish Navy before. And it didn't go super well. After less than 1 mile, it heeled over and sank. And then they pulled it up in the 20th century. And it's a really well-preserved, really fascinating ship. And one of the problems with it is that it was top-heavy, which is essentially why it sank. And it was top-heavy because there were all of these carved wooden figures to like strike fear into the hearts of the Danes. And it's like, we've all worked on that project. And Pete Cheslock does a really great talk about this that you can go watch a video of 17th century shipbuilding in your failed software project, because it's excellent. I can't do it justice. But I bring it up because if you think about it, it's great if you have ideas, super, but you actually have to implement them, and they actually have to work and hopefully not sink to the bottom of the harbor. And I think that that's one of the places where it's so important for us to have free open source software, because otherwise what you end up with is the shipwright dies and you have like, no idea what they tried to implement. And it's like, it would be better if they were using something that wasn't their artisanal, bespoke, hand-whittled platform. I mean, I built one of those. We all built one of those, right? Like, ours was built out of Docker, Packer, Chef, AWS, and like a bunch of janky bash, because if people tell you that there's no janky bash underlying the homegrown platform, they are lying. There's definitely janky bash in there. But like, we've all built stuff like that. We've all regretted it. We've all been on a Slack later with our former coworkers who are still trying to get it working. And like, this is kind of, again, one of those places where this is human factors. It's not something that we solve, no matter how great the technology is. Also, I love bash, and I write it as a tool of choice for pretty much everything. But, okay, so we all agree that tech itself is not gonna save us or the Vasa sadly. But there's also like that question of the interactions inside our team. And I think it's really important for us to try to build distributed systems, or complex distributed systems, with the understanding that people are going to be part of this. People are going to operate it. They're going to have opinions about like exactly what kind of state do we have? Can we document or even really fully comprehend all of it ourselves? Like if our systems become so complex that one or two people can't even really hold the mental map of them in our heads, we have problems. I've talked to people who work at other large cloud providers who have gotten that second system syndrome, where they're trying to build up a second thing to replace the very important old thing that no one really understands anymore. And it's like, yeah, you probably should have started building that second thing earlier. And also, those people who did understand it would have been much happier if they could have distributed some of that load and some of that knowledge before they became a giant single point of failure in the complex system that they built. And this is, again, like, I would say when people say like, oh, well, you know, we'll fix this by having small teams. And it's like, that's cool. It's fine for you to have, you know, 2 pizza teams. I mean, I have many questions about how hungry these people are and like how large the pizzas are, but okay, we'll give you that. You can have a 2 pizza team. But at some point, that team probably has to intersect with something else in your organization. Maybe security, or maybe like, you know, purchasing. Like there's a lot of parts where just having small, theoretically independent cross-functional teams doesn't necessarily solve anything if you can't expand the communication beyond that. So I would say then people say, okay, well, we will definitely solve this with microservices because they solve everything, right? And like, yes, they will definitely help you solve some of your problems. However, my boss at Drama Fever, Tim Gross, likes to call it conservation of complexity. Like, you're still going to have complexity, you're just going to put it somewhere else. And that might be fine, and that might be a trade-off you want to make, and that might be exactly what you want. But if you move your IPC into network timeouts, you haven't actually made it go away. Like, you've just changed where your problem is. And that's fine, and it can be very valuable, but I always want to, I have played the microservices game. I have lived that movie. It doesn't actually solve all the problems you think it solves. It just moves them around, which, again, it might be fine. And I think that it's, by the way, did you folks know Mel Conway is actually still alive and on Twitter, which is like amazing. But Conway's Law, people look at that and they think, excellent, so we're going to roll out a new system, so we need to reorg around that new system. And I look at that and I think, okay, so honestly, I think the most important word in Conway's Law, and you know, if you can't read it on the screen, it just says that, this is a paraphrase of it, but it just says that if you're designing a system, you're going to get a design that produces a copy of your organization's communication structure. And people read that as organization structure, and I think the most important word in Conway's Law is actually communication. Like, you don't necessarily have to reorg every time you have a new initiative, as long as you have good cross-team communication, so that things don't get dropped on the floor, or there's not so much like blame game stuff that takes up a lot of time and is inefficient and not great. And we've seen people say that they've solved this because they only communicate through APIs and that the teams don't actually talk to each other, and so therefore there can't be misunderstandings. And I was like, so one of the many problems with that is, what if you really need to deprecate something? Okay, I mean, you better talk to people, like bring pizza, right? Like this is not something that you solve necessarily without good team interactions. So I think, I hope that pizza's not made of Soylent Green. But our tech super is, right? Because like, we're all in this room, you know, taking our Saturday to talk about tech with each other because we're trying to solve these problems. I think it's important for us to realize that there are many technical solutions. There are many vendors, there are many tools. There really isn't a right one. We do have some seats up front. Like, it will not disturb me at all if people want to sit down. There are some seats. There's no SeaWorld rules here. The first 3 rows will not get wet. So, but like if we're trying to solve our technical problems, I think it's really tempting, and I've seen this a lot of times, and I've probably fallen into this myself, is like we can build a really complex Rube Goldberg machine that doesn't really need to be the way it is, but we totally wanted to use some NoSQL and Docker and Kubernetes and whatever that we wanted to glue together to make one of those what have you built memes. And I think that this is a problem in an organization when the incentives, again, are back to, well, what's the best thing for my resume? The best thing for my resume is definitely to build a thing that no one's going to be able to maintain and they're probably going to move away from as soon as I quit. Like that's just the reality that we run into. And I think it's really important and I'm really trying to get this idea to take hold in our industry, is that you do not have to innovate the totally greenfield thing to add value. Like, and this is from Laura Bell from New Zealand, and she's fantastic. And I really appreciate this idea that, like, if you look at kind of a Simon Wardley idea of pioneers, settlers, town planners, like your pioneers instantiate something and your settlers scale it up and your town planners make it totally routine and boring. And like, I'm on Team Settler. And like, not just because I'm totally wearing Settlers Catan leggings, though I am, but I like the idea of, yeah, it's cool to come in when something has been proof of concepted, is that a word? But exists, and then, all right, let's operationalize this. Like, let's make this so that people can, I don't know, actually count on it. That's kind of exciting. But I think there's a lot of glamour and tech around the new shiny. It's like, how about the old shiny that actually stays shiny and works? Like, I'm fine with that. And I also think this is Astrid Atkinson is a director at Google, and she likes to say she started working at a little startup in 2004, and it's called Google, and she still works there. And what she points out is that, and this tweet is old, this is from like 2013, that people get really attached to the solution that they created, and they get really attached to their ideas, and they wrap their ego up in it, and then you're like, but perhaps we should not use a session store as our important permanent data store. And people are like, no, because that was something that they came up with and they're excited about it. I think that that's where we have to, again, like just strictly tactically, even if you do not care about what other people think because they're wrong, tactically, you're going to get a lot more results you want if you understand why they are emotionally attached to their terrible, terrible ideas. So that's basically like, okay, tech is made of people, and we also, at the same time, you're sitting there thinking, so are you telling me that the intern should be able to YOLO that questionable data store out into production? I'm like, no, I'm definitely not saying that. I'm saying that we want to have good constraints around what we're choosing, and I don't mean the terrible wall of confusion. This is from the polar vortex a couple years ago. My spouse is standing on Lake Superior. But this is, I think it's really important for us to have the kind of constraints inside our organizations that maybe just are warning signs, that are maybe just, hey, we tried that, this is what happened, is that a trade-off we're willing to live with? And again, these are conversations that we have to have with other humans, because there's never going to be a clear-cut, easy answer that is right? I mean, you know that. There's not a right answer. There's just a bunch of less bad answers that might not get you paged in the middle of the night. And like, that's how you choose, right? And I think it's valuable, again, to think about, I was talking about Conway's law earlier, and I'll bring up CAB theorem too, because we've got to hit the bingo card. I'm sure somebody has a bingo card somewhere. And what I like to think about when I think about CAB theorem is Katie McCaffrey, a colleague of mine actually at Microsoft, she started about when I did last year, likes to say that you don't get to choose to not have partitions, like, because physics and math, like you have to choose between consistency and availability. Like, those are your choices. You don't get to choose to not have anything ever go wrong in your systems. And not just for partitions, but just like reaching beyond that. I think that a lot of systems that people create, they like to, map out the happy path. And they're like, this will be wonderful. And then those of us who are ops people at heart are like, unless They're like, why do you hate everything? I'm like, I just hate being awakened at night. And I think that this is one of those places where it's actually, I think it's valuable for us to take some lessons from the distributed systems world, again, and apply them to our organizations. Like, for example, you're going to get better decisions if the people closest to the side effects and bad effects have input. Like, if you can push as much decision-making to the edge as possible, instead of like central command and control telling you to do things, you have the people who are actually on the ground understanding it. It's like, my brother is a retired Army Ranger, and like the US military figured this out. Like, they don't do the central command and control thing anymore. It's like, maybe in tech we should stop trying to do that, because a lot of places still do. And I think that there's another, like, and that, again, this also has to do with our distributed organizations. Like, no one wants to wait for 10 hours for headquarters to wake up to make a decision. Like, that's going to ruin everything. And yet some organizations still run that way. Or the important decision maker wasn't on the call. I guess we're not going to decide. It's like, really? Was that a good use of everyone's time? I also think that, like, in terms of the way we run our communications, it's super important, right, to remember that people might not be taking away from the meeting what you thought that you put out there. And if we don't build our important computer systems with a bunch of UDP. Like, that would be ridiculous. But think about how many meetings that you've left and you're super positive that something was decided, and someone else is super positive that something way different was decided, and you're like, why did we not check on this? Like, we can have sins and acts in our human communications. It's like, really? Just like send out the summary email. We're technologists. We all know how to have consistency in our communications. Like, we make TCP do this every day, but we somehow manage to miss it in our meetings a lot. And instead, I think that we try to make architectural decisions either based on the stickers on my old laptop, or and the cat really likes the cat likes Docker. The cat's sitting right there. We make those kind of decisions around what tribalism and fashion might lead to. And we might not be using Occam's razor and just thinking the laptop is warm. All right, that's why the cat's sitting there. It's sometimes our answers are a lot simpler than we think they are, but we're going to get better choices if we empower the people who are the most affected by the choices to choose, instead of just picking the cutest stickers. If we want to do what's right, not just what's expedient, I should also point out that when the Cambridge Analytica stuff came out, I wasn't surprised at all, because I actually built systems like that in 2012 when I worked at an ad tech startup that harvested people's friends' likes and fed them into MapReduce jobs. And I was mostly focused on how fun all the HBase and Hadoop stuff was. And I wasn't really focused on, did these people's friends really want their data in there? And I think that's something that we all fall into, because MapReduce and HBase, this is fun and this is interesting, and we're building stuff that we think is great, and perhaps technically it is really cool, but I think it's incumbent upon us as technologists to look back and think, or to look at anything we're considering doing and being like, yeah, we absolutely can build this. Should we? Are we gonna make the world worse if we build this? I think that's actually really important, and it's something that we don't talk about enough in tech. So that's something I would definitely point out. Because I gotta tell you, we're definitely living in a different sci-fi reality than the one I thought we were gonna live in. I wasn't expecting oppressive cyberpunk dystopia to be the card that came up, and it did. And I think that doesn't mean, and I'm sure you all saw the news that the planet apparently has only 12 years left, which, what? Okay, I will tell you that the good news is I'm way less worried about the end of epoch time now. But on the other hand, we probably would prefer to have air and water and Wi-Fi, all of the essentials in the pyramid of needs. We probably want to prefer to have that. And so I think it is important for us to think as technologists about, is the stuff that we're doing going to make the planet better or worse? That's maybe not something that we all thought about when we started in technology, but it matters now. And I think it matters because we don't want to make the world worse. We don't want to make our coworkers less happy. We don't want to make our end users less happy. I mean, obviously. But I think that we focus so much on the technology, and like, I have news for you. Like, you can't take a shipping container with 800 units of DevOps in it and like just deliver that and unpack it and everything is fine. Like, that doesn't actually work. And we can't, we especially in our organizations can't have 600 of those units of DevOps go to the favored few and then tell other people, you're running things in maintenance mode. Like, do you really think that they're gonna be okay with that? Or are they going to get resentful and maybe not do as well, or maybe just leave because we haven't considered what those humans need? Like, no, even if somebody is maintaining an important legacy system, that doesn't mean that their ideas and their needs don't matter. But that doesn't mean, and I wanna be careful to not make it sound like I'm just saying everything has to be shiny and new all the time, because Deming did, he did you can read about Deming, he did a lot of like analysis around industrial processes. And he made the point that I think is quite salient, that it doesn't mean that we have to change everything all the time. It does mean that if we decide not to change anything, we are definitely gonna be the sad snowman. And I can offer myself up as evidence. Like, I was pretty darn good at running those SunOS 413 boxes. And pour one out on the curb for Sun. I know 414 was real, but I feel like 413 was the SunOS. And I was good at it. And you know what? That is not a valuable skill anymore. And that is okay. And I can actually do Kubernetes stuff now. But, like, long technology leap there. But but not as far as you would think, because zones, hello, in Solaris. But I think it's really important for us to remember that we have to be open to learning from the people around us, because change is inevitable. On the other hand, I don't want to denigrate anything that is that legacy system, because I think a really good test for whether that legacy system matters is if you say you're going to turn it off and you see how many people like have a heart attack. And like, if they're really upset about the idea of turning it off, it probably matters. Like, that's probably where all the customer data is. That's probably the legacy data store that no one really wants to finish migrating, but they super need. So I think that is important. And you know who's running those legacy data stores? Is you and me and everyone is calling us the boring legacy thing. And you're like, why you have paychecks. Okay, just so you know. And that's why it's really important. Like, not to, and then this is back to the human factors, how our colleagues feel. If people feel like the stuff they're doing isn't being valued, they're not gonna do it as well, and they might leave, and then you'll have really terrifying legacy problems, and the person who understands them isn't there anymore. So I think that it is really important, and that means we're all pulling together. Like, it totally sounds like I'm just saying, oh, love and hearts and flowers, and I'm like, no, it's more like you're on that ship and you really would prefer it not sink, and you're gonna all pull on the ropes together, and maybe it's not the one that you're used to working on, but you're gonna learn, you're gonna help each other. Like, I think that that's really important. So basically, I would say in our technological systems, it's really important for us to recognize that change is going to keep coming, just as steady as the waves, like it is. This tweet is from my colleague, Eric St. Martin. He worked at Disney and Comcast and a bunch of places, and he started GopherCon with Brian Kettleson. They both actually work on the same team as me at Microsoft now. And I like that he points out that Kubernetes is not the end game. He kind of does a halt and catch fire reference here and says, it's not the thing, it's the thing that gets us to the thing. It gets us, whatever the technology du jour is. I always tell people who are coming to a workshop and trying to determine if they too should be Kubering some netties, and I'm like, look, does it solve a problem you have? If it solves a problem you have, then super, yeah, you should definitely be looking at this. And if you look at all the use cases and benefits and you're like, we don't really have those problems, like, okay, that's cool. It's not actually mandatory for you to take everything on the front page of Hacker News and YOLO it out into production immediately. Like, you have permission from me to not do that. But like, there is going to be change though, and it just keeps coming. Like, the change does not end. The fact that, Jeffrey Snover, the creator of PowerShell, pointed out like about a week ago or so on Twitter that Azure is more than 50% Linux now. It's like, I got to tell you, I do think we live in the darkest timeline, but I don't think that everything in this timeline is terrible, and that is pretty cool. I'll take that. I mean, let's be perfectly honest, I mostly ran FreeBSD at home until like 2015 when I was like, I don't have time. I'm traveling too much. But Linux is super important, and it's super important to like some of the largest organizations in the world that you might. I already had several people, including when I walked in yesterday, heckle me about like, Microsoft branding. And I'm like, honestly, look, if you didn't see the news this week, the fact that Microsoft just gave 60,000 patents to the Open Invention Network should say something. It's like, right? Like, this is, and this is not just because I'm saying my employer did a good thing. Cool, they've done a lot of things I don't agree with too. I'm really happy though that I think that the moral arc of the world is moving towards more open. It is moving towards the kind of world that we would all like to live in, the world we're trying to create and we've been trying to create for a long time. And this is actually my pinned tweet, and it does kind of seem like some sort of zany joke, but like the reality is, yeah, I have a Mac with a Microsoft asset tag on it, and my job is to get people to use Linux on Azure. And from this, we can all conclude that 2018 is super weird, but it's also, it's okay. Like, I want us to all be challenged to go back to our employers and go back to maybe our customers and think about how can we reach across barriers? How can we break down those barriers? How can we be more open working with each other? That's how we build a better world, and I'm really excited that everyone here is working on that. So, thanks.
Thanks so much, Bridget. What a fantastic narrative.